Francisco de Zurbarán, who lives between 1598 and 1664, is one of the great Spanish painters. Alongside Diego Velázquez and Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, he is regarded as one of the triumvirate of painters who shaped the art of 17th century Spain.
But unlike Velázquez, who works at the court throughout his career, Zurbarán dedicates himself to painting mostly religious scenes, and especially in Seville, the city with which he's most closely identified. If Velázquez is a painter of Las Meninas, of the Rokeby Venus, he is someone who is quite separate from Zurbarán, indeed from Murillo, who is one of the painters with whom Zurbarán also associated during his time in Seville. Zurbarán, unlike the two painters you see on the screen, has had lesser renown here in Britain, and this is the very first major monographic exhibition dedicated to Zurbarán ever to take place in the United Kingdom. So we're very, very honored to be able to present it to you. And that is, I think, because Zurbarán has long been denied his moment in the spotlight, and it is long overdue. I am now going to recede into the shadows, but I'll come back in just a moment.
It is both the delight and slight challenge of co-curating an exhibition that we're tag teaming today, but instead of Daniel having to sit on the stage and listen to me, we'll weave seamlessly in and out of the darkness, which, as you see as we go through the exhibition, will be very fitting for an artist who uses chiaroscuro so dramatically. So, a little bit of biography before we dive into the paintings. Zurbarán is born in the town of Fuente de Cantos in the arid, sparsely populated region of Extremadura in 1598. Extremadura is sort of Spain's furthest, most western edge, and it's not a particularly sort of bustling part of the country. He's the sixth child of a relatively well-to-do family. His father was a merchant, a tax collector. He traded in, amongst other things, fabric, and you'll see as we go through the exhibition that becomes potentially quite important. At the age of 15, he sends his son, Francisco de Zurbarán, to Seville, 70 miles to the south, to train as an artist. So on the 15th of January 1614, Zurbarán signs a 3-year contract with the artist Pedro Diaz de Villanueva, about whom we know almost nothing today. We know that he's training as a pintor de imaginaria, so a painter of sculpted images, but we know no works by his master. We know nothing from that moment of Zurbarán's career. But I think the key thing for you to sort of hold in your heads as we start looking at Zurbarán's paintings is that 3 years of training is not only for him to learn how to paint, but he also learns how to carve and how to gild. So right from the beginning of his career, Zurbarán is being encouraged to think in a 3-dimensional way about art. Seville, at the time that Zurbarán is there, is one of, if not the richest city in Europe. Since 1503, it's had a monopoly on trade with the newly discovered Americas. So that means that twice a year, a fleet leaves from Seville to travel across the Atlantic to New Spain and the newly discovered territories in Central and Southern America. And twice a year, a fleet returns back laden with mineral wealth, with silver, with gold, pottery, tobacco, unimaginable riches, which makes Seville exceptionally wealthy and also exceptionally international. I don't know that we would necessarily think about that today, but this is a city with a huge, thriving international population of merchants and dealers and people, caught up in the excitement of this wealth bubble. So Zurbarán spends 3 years in the heart of this bustling city before establishing himself back in his home region of Extremadura. Nothing survives from this period, but we know from documents and kind of commission documents that he's obviously successful quite early on. So at one point he's asked to paint an altarpiece to the Virgin in his hometown of Fuente de Cantos. At another he's asked to carve a life-sized Christ for a monastery nearby. Probably even from that early moment when he's literally sort of 20, in his early 20s, he would have had a workshop working with him. But the mid-1620s is the moment that Zurbarán's career really takes off in a stratospheric way. It's the moment when he comes back to Seville and he's commissioned to paint 21 pictures for the Dominican order at San Pablo el Real. And from this commission, we encounter Zurbarán's first signed and dated painting. So as you go down the stairs after this talk, this is the first picture that you'll really encounter in the first room of the show. And I think for us, there really was only one way in which we could begin the exhibition, and it had to be this towering crucifixion, which has come to us all the way from the Art Institute in Chicago. We find on the crumpled little tiny piece of paper right at the bottom of the crucifix, Zurbarán's signature and the date. So it's that kind of gives us the clue, the fact that it sort of establishes for us that it's his earliest known painting. But beyond that, beyond just being the first signed and dated work to survive, this is really a picture that encapsulates everything that is so unique and powerful about Zurbarán at this moment in his career. Should always say the caveat, the screen does nothing for the scale and power of these pictures. So please do come downstairs later, recognize that this is, over 2 meters tall, nearly 3 meters in height. It's exceptionally overpowering to stand in front of. And that monumental scale is something that the artist is definitely playing with. The screen does, I think, let you see the dramatic lighting. So Zurbarán has sometimes been called the Spanish Caravaggio, and you can see here that Christ's body is very, very brightly lit against this impenetrable black background. It's a bold, monochromatic palette on this painting. I mean, there's almost no color in it. And I think all of those things work together to emphasize this extraordinary sense of physicality, this feeling that there's a real body there in front of us. And indeed, we know that's how people at the time felt. So at the beginning of the 18th century, the art historian Antonio Palomino writes about this painting, "Everyone who sees it and does not know it believes it to be a sculpture." So there's this sense, really right from the beginning of Zurbarán's career, that his pictures have a presence which is very, very particular and very powerful. And this painting makes Zurbarán's name and reputation in Seville. So it's painted in 1627. 2 years later, in 1629, the city council formally invite the artist to make his home in the city. And they say, we're going to make an exception for you. You don't have to do the guild exams. You don't have to behave like other artists. We know that you're a consummate painter. And they single out this painting in particular. So the document that says, "By the painting of Christ, which is in the sacristy of San Pablo, one can judge that he is a consummate artist." And really from this moment, commissions for Zurbarán in Seville flow thick and fast. So the first room of the exhibition has not only this crucifixion, but also this fabulous and strange painting from the Museo del Prado of the apparition of St. Peter to St. Peter Nolasco. This is one of 22 paintings that he's asked to paint for the Mercedarian order. The Mercedarians are a military order. They were founded in Spain in the 13th century by Peter Nolasco, who you see on the right. And think here you really get a sense of the power of Zurbarán's storytelling. So Peter Nolasco is desperate to go to Rome to see the tomb of St. Peter. St. Peter famously doesn't believe himself to be worthy to be crucified upright like Christ, so in fact had himself crucified upside down. And it is thus that he appears in a vision to Peter Nolasco saying, no, don't travel to Rome, continue your good works here in Spain. But I think the power of this picture, it's incredibly powerful even today. And for me, it's partly because there's nothing else in it. There's no setting, there's no accoutrement, it's just this blaze of heavenly light, this dark, dark background, and this moment where the celestial and the earthly collide. Across the room, the kind of final picture in that first room, we have this masterpiece of Zurbarán's career, we're thrilled to have borrowed from the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, a picture of St. Serapion, also painted for the Mercedarians. I wanted to include this at the beginning, not only because I think Zurbarán is sometimes talked about as a painter of white, and I think if you look at this picture, you can kind of understand why. The sculptural quality that these robes have in person, it really does almost feel as if you're looking at a sculpture rather than a painting. But also because, although he often depicts people who have had violent things done to them, there is a serenity that we find in Zurbarán's paintings. So St. Serapion is horribly martyred. He's disemboweled, he's partially decapitated. We see none of that here. There's no blood on these robes. It's an extremely sort of serene, calm, eerie painting to stand in front of. So that's our first room, and we were very, very lucky to get these 3 masterpieces and be able to put them together. The second room in the show sort of continues this theme, looking at Zurbarán as someone who does paint for the religious orders. So I've said already that Seville is an extremely wealthy city in this moment. Obviously, the history of wealth, certainly in Europe, or for much of the history of Europe, is that with wealth comes the desire to commission great works. And where in Spain, Madrid is really the court city and a city where the king or the crown is the primary patron, Seville, by contrast, not only has trade, but it's also the great religious center in southern Spain. And that fleet that goes out twice a year to the Americas, not only is it bringing a huge amount of wealth back, but it's also sending missionaries, religious orders, people out to the Americas to convert the local populace, to establish Christianity there. So there's a huge number of different orders in Seville. There are Dominicans, Jesuits, Mercedarians, there's Carthusians just outside, all these different Franciscans, all these different religious orders, all of whom are benefiting from the wealth of the city, all of whom want to have great, grand, glorious spaces that they can fill with powerful paintings. Worth saying briefly, too, that obviously Zurbarán is living in the aftermath of the Council of Trent. That's, a long period for the Catholic Church in the 16th century, but it's a moment in which the Church really reaffirms that art has a particular purpose. Paintings are not merely decorative. They're there to tell stories. They're there to inspire faith. They're there to help people in their devotion. And that's really what we see in the many, many different pictures that Zurbarán paints for religious orders. And in the second room of the show, probably the most important group of pictures that we've assembled came from this monastery of Nuestra Señora de la Defensión in Jerez de la Frontera, which is just outside Cádiz, about 60 miles south of Seville. It's a monastery that was founded in the 15th century. It had been founded in this particular place to commemorate supposedly a battle, a victorious battle of Christians against the Moorish troops in Spain at the time. And it was already, by Zurbarán's lifetime, a very substantial religious complex. I mean, hopefully you get a sense from this picture of quite how large this is. But in 1636, the prior decides actually he wants to replace the medieval altarpiece with something a little more substantial. So Zurbarán is invited to paint an altarpiece 15 meters high and 10 meters wide, to which he contributes overall 12 different paintings. So this is a 19th century reconstruction. You can see, looking at this actually takes place over 4 tiers. But that's the space that Zurbarán was asked to paint for. So just to give you a sense of the scale on which he is working. So as I say, he contributes 12 paintings over 3 tiers. These paintings were surrounded by gilded columns. There were sculptures of the 12 apostles. There was a sculpted Christ on the cross at the top. And it must have been one of the most incredible things you would have been able to see in 17th century Spain. You get a little sense of a kind of reconstruction here. And we have to reconstruct it because, unfortunately, between the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century and the dissolution of the Spanish monasteries in 1836, the altarpiece was dismantled. So although we do know the 12 pictures, or we know at least 12, if not more, that come from the site, we're not entirely sure how they were arranged. So for a long time, it was thought that the central picture in this altarpiece was a painting of St. Bruno, today in Cádiz. St. Bruno is the founder of the Carthusian order. There's a group of people who say that's very normal for the Carthusians to have an altarpiece celebrating their founder. There's also another group of scholars who would say that's a very unusual thing to have in the middle of an altarpiece, which is why art history is so fun, because we get to endlessly debate these things between one another. And in fact, what we are suggesting in the show is that although this is a very kind of marvelous and impressive picture, we're wondering if this might not, in fact, have been the central piece of that middle tier of the altarpiece. So this painting on the right is one that we've been absolutely thrilled to borrow from the National Museum in Poznan. Again, it looks tiny on the screen. It's over 3 meters tall. So getting that here from Poland has been a fantastic challenge, and one we've been working on. I think the negotiations for this have taken about 4 years. So we are beyond delighted that you can come and see it downstairs. It is, as you hopefully see here, a very, very beautiful picture. So we see the Virgin enthroned in splendor. She's there with the Christ child on her knee in this kind of blaze of divine light. Really, I think the magical thing is that at the foot of these carpeted stairs, and the carpet is so beautiful and it's strewn with these gorgeous still life flowers, but at the bottom there you see the Carthusians kind of kneeling, gazing up at her, their heads thrust upwards. And really the nature of the composition is that we, standing in front of it, also have to tilt our heads up. We have it downstairs flanked by the Adoration of the Magi and the Circumcision, 2 paintings from the Musée de Grenoble, which we know were there were 4 in this series that were the sort of side pictures of the altarpiece. But when you look at this together downstairs, just remember that painting, the central one, imagine it on top of itself. That's how high this would have been. That's the kind of angle that unfortunately we've got ceilings, so we can't quite recreate that for you. But just to give a sense of the grandeur, and I'll show you some details here, because this really is an exceptional work and one that we really hope people will spend a lot of time with. And there are other pictures in the room as well. We have a single painting painted for the Jesuits in which Zurbarán's telling a really complicated story about the veneration of Sacred Hearts. We've got pictures painted for the Franciscans, but hopefully what you get in that room is a sense that, wow, this is someone who can really tell stories on a very dramatic scale in a very powerful way. And with that, I shall disappear into the shadows and hand over to Daniel.
This is quite a good double back, this emerging from the wings. I quite like it. The next section of the exhibition, the third room, is called The Fabric of Saints, because Zurbarán, perhaps more than anything else, is famed in his lifetime as a painter of really extraordinary single-finger, standing female saints. A great example of which is this Saint Casilda. These female saints are a really important part of his oeuvre. They're used in some cases as church decorations, so they're often made in series, and some are made in pairs or indeed in individual canvases. And those are the ones that we've strived to represent in the exhibition, because those are the ones generally of the highest possible quality. There's something that has always confused and perplexed about these pictures, because while they are, of course, representations of saints, it's long been held, at least since the 19th century and perhaps before, that they may also, in some cases, represent real people. So they could be sort of people portrayed in the guise of a saint. Here we have Saint Casilda. Casilda, a 10th century Muslim princess in Toledo, who is sympathetic to the Christian prisoners that have been captured by her father, and goes to bring them bread rolls. She has them gathered up in her skirts as she descends down into the dungeon, and she is caught in the act by a guard. And in that moment, the miracle is that the bread rolls turn into roses. And so that's what we see gathered in the folds of her skirt that she holds out ahead of us. You can see also, as you maybe have already picked out in some of the other pictures, that Zurbarán is a consummate painter of fabric and of textile. And while in some ways that may sound like a small thing, I think especially in a picture like this, with this really beautiful sayo, which is the long artichoke sort of decorated garment that we see that Casilda is holding up, these are things that take up not only a lot of the pictorial space, but a lot of his pictorial imagination, because they don't seem to correspond to any known fabrics. You can see, of course, that the trim she has is especially splendid with pearls and jewels along the hem of the sayo. And you get a sense that Zurbarán was inventing these fabrics. And it seems, since we don't have any replicas of them or anything that exists in terms of something that would give us a sense of what Zurbarán was painting, that he, and has often been discussed as the first Spanish fashion designer, because of the way that he puts together all of these different things. These figures, especially in 19th century France, where many of them were first displayed outside Spain for the first time after having come out of religious houses in the early 19th century, as Franz said, occasioned this sort of odd conversation between something being real and something being divine, which was, as we've seen, is a major part of Zurbarán's practice. These works occasioned that kind of reaction not only in his own time, but also later on. And I think in a couple of the pictures that we'll see slightly later in the section, you get a sense of how it is that these very individualized physiognomies really bring you into an encounter with a real person. But Zurbarán, as I said, was a fashion designer. And Cristóbal Balenciaga, one of the major Spanish fashion designers of the 20th century, is known to have admired his pictures and indeed to have been inspired by them. His collections of the 1950s show a lot of similarities between the works that we see, like the Thyssen, Santa Casilda, and this really wonderful ensemble that he's designed in about 1951. You can also see it in slightly later collections from 1962. These are things that clearly Balenciaga has been inspired by. And so thinking about this relationship between fabric and volume and drapery and Zurbarán, we get a sense that Zurbarán not only knew these fabrics, but it seems, had some kind of training, at least, or understanding of them. Because his father, Luis, was a trader who sometimes traded in fabrics. So it seems he would have had contact with this kind of material from a very young age. And we know from a document that exists late in his life that Zurbarán himself, we don't encounter a lot of documents in which we have sort of his voice or his words, but there's a notarial document that says that he is sort of pursuing payment from a purveyor in Madrid to whom he has sold silk thread from Seville. So Francisco the painter himself seems perhaps to have engaged in this trade in fashion. This picture, our own St. Margaret of Antioch, is another of these really monumental single-figure standing female saints. She's different in some ways than the other pictures because she isn't wearing these sort of resplendent aristocratic robes that give you the sense of saintliness and beauty. She's instead represented as a very, very fancy shepherd. She is dressed to the nines to be out in the field. St. Margaret of Antioch, of course, is the patron saint of childbirth because she was consumed by the dragon, who we see down here, and used a small cross, according to which hagiography you believe, to burst her way out of the dragon's belly. So this patron saint of childbirth. We see her here, completely unbothered by the dragon below. Not a care in the world. And this painting is one of the individual ones. There's no pair, so it seems that it's one that Zurbarán has really lavished a lot of care and attention on. Zurbarán, like many, many Spanish painters, indeed many painters all across Europe in this period, is someone who bases often his compositions on prints or on other engraved sources. And in this case, we know which one he was looking at. It's this one by Hans Bringerklee of St. Margaret of Antioch. And you can see that despite him having been inspired roughly for the composition, he makes it entirely his own with the really luscious representation of fabrics. He reverses, of course, the image and changes in some ways the representation of the dragon. So Zurbarán, while using sources like any artist would, is someone who always evolves and innovates beyond them. And it's especially interesting for our picture that the fabric that he's depicted here, the alforjas, these saddlebags slung over her arm, relate probably to a fabric that comes from the Sierra de Huelva, which is an area very close to Fuente de Cantos, to Llerena, and to Seville, sort of a mountainous region in between all three. But thinking about these retratos a lo divino, so sanctified portraits, portraits of real people in the guise of saints, these two works, a pair of works that come to us from the Museo de Bellas Artes de Bilbao, are ones that have often been considered to be almost certainly representations of real people. As long as we have their provenance, they have been together. St. Catherine of Alexandria on the left, and St. Elizabeth of Thuringia, of Hungary, on the right. And their similarity, and the similarity of their faces, has given rise to the idea that they might actually be sisters, and that these are painted in the guise of the saints that are their name saints. So it could be that this is a young girl named Catarina on the left and a young girl named Isabel on the right. We don't quite know, but I think the reality of these faces is such that we can think, or at least encounter, that we encounter real people in them. And this kind of image, we're not talking about this image in this writer's remarks. Bernardino de Villegas, he's writing in the mid-1620s, and he says, "What could be more indecent than an image of Our Lady with a full skirt, clothing, a cape, a ruff, a wreath, a necklace, and the like, and holy virgins dressed so profanely and with so many trinkets and finery that they resemble nothing more than the most extravagant ladies in the world." this very moralizing Jesuit is responding to images just like this. So we know that this tradition of representing real people as saints was something common enough that Villegas felt that he should comment. And we also know, in an interesting inquisitorial record from the late 16th century in Cuenca, in central Spain, that a priest there, a cathedral official, complained to his relative, a certain Don Miguel, that the painting that he had of St. Catherine of Alexandria represented not a saint, but in fact his paramour. And the quote goes, quote, "You get yourself a portrait or a figure of your lady friend, you put a sword in her hand and look, St. Catherine." So this idea of connection between the divine and the human can both be one that's rather saintly and one that in this case is rather worldly. He also paints, of course, monumental single-figure standing male saints. We initially, when we were planning this exhibition, thought that we might do a whole room on St. Francis. But of course, we were pipped to the post by our own exhibition on St. Francis, and so we felt we didn't have to do that again. But we have put together in this exhibition two really, really important pictures of St. Francis, one our own and one this really masterful version of the standing St. Francis. This is how he was supposed to have been found in the 14th century when his tomb was opened by two popes and they encountered his body looking very, very good indeed, completely uncorrupt, standing in his tomb and at attention. And so that is the moment that has been depicted by Zurbarán. This is an extremely interesting painting because it had come to France already in the 18th century, and in the process of conservation that was carried out at the Musée Beaux-Arts de Lyon 2 years ago, they discovered for the first time, after an extensive cleaning, signature and a date, which you can see at the very bottom left of the picture. It's quite dark down in the exhibition, but you can just make it out, I think, if you look closely. The other great picture of St. Francis is, of course, our own from the National Gallery's collection. This is one that we have long held here in London. We acquired it in 1853 at the sale, which was of the collection of the King of France, Louis Philippe. At that same sale, that very large picture of the Virgin of the Rosary from Poznan was also acquired by a Count Raczynski. So it's an interesting connection between these two works. In this one, we see St. Francis looking skyward. You can just make out the stigmata on the back of his right hand, and he is praying in meditation. This is a great icon now of Zurbarán's art, and indeed when people think of Zurbarán often, I think, in this country, you think of these rather sort of severe, austere, brown saints, these Franciscans. Instead, and I think as you've already seen, we can now encounter him as a great colorist, as someone who is creative and as someone who is innovative. He's also innovative in works like this, though. And when it was acquired for the National Gallery in 1853, it occasioned some rather vociferous criticism. A critic of the National Gallery's acquisition policies at the time, they existed now as they existed then as they do now, said that in the Times newspaper, he wrote in to say that this St. Francis is a small, black, repulsive picture, and we should have got something much, much better. Two very eminent Spanish art historians of the 19th century, William Sterling Maxwell and his colleague, write in reply saying, "You've got it all wrong. This is the greatest example of technical execution and mastery that we have of Zurbarán's single-figure saints." And that, I think, is a judgment that has held up. And so we're very, very pleased to be able to show it along with the Lyon picture in the third room of the exhibition. But to speak about the fourth, we'll bring back Francesca.
So up to this point, we've taken you on a kind of broadly chronological journey through Zurbarán's career. So we've started in 1627 with his earliest signed and dated painting. We've shown you some of the major religious commissions from the 1620s and 1630s, known as Zurbarán's golden years. A lot of the single-figure saints seem to come from the 1630s as well. But by the time we reached the fourth room of the exhibition, we wanted to do something slightly different. Because Zurbarán is the kind of great religious painter of his century, he is often being asked to paint very, very specific things. And there are some themes, inevitably, in a kind of church or religious context, that he has to come back to over and over. So, for example, we know across the course of his career, he paints at least 15 versions of the Immaculate Conception. We know today at least a dozen crucifixions by his hand. There may well have been more that haven't come down to us. But what we really wanted to show was that actually Zurbarán's an artist who doesn't rest on his laurels. So in this room, we've paired 2 Immaculate Conceptions and 2 crucifixions. And the invitation from us to you is really to sort of spend time with these pictures. They were all painted as altarpieces. They are pictures that people would have seen year in, year out, in, day out, repeatedly over and over again in the context of religious services. And they are pictures that really warrant close looking. So here you can see 2 versions of the Immaculate Conception painted maybe sort of 5, 6, 7 years apart, one from Barcelona on the left, one from Edinburgh on the right. The Immaculate Conception is very, very important to Zurbarán's adopted city of Seville. The Immaculate Conception refers not to Christ's conception, but to Mary's conception. It's the idea that she herself is conceived without sin, and it's her sinlessness, her purity, which enables Christ, in turn, to be conceived without sin. And Seville is a very fervently Immaculist city in the 17th century. It's something people feel very passionately about. People actually kill each other about whether or not this is indeed true. So it's something that he's asked to paint over and over. But I think if you sit with these pictures, you can appreciate that, even when tackling the same theme, he's an artist who's able to do some quite different things with them. On the other side of the room, we have a really, I think, very striking comparison of 2 crucifixions across an even broader chronological range. So on the left here, you see the Crucified Christ, which is a masterpiece from the Museo de Bellas Artes in Seville. Feel free to tell me which bit of white paint you think is better, but for my money, this is the best bit of, or one of the best bits of white paint in the history of art. I mean, that loincloth, when you stand in front of it, is so incredibly luminous. The volume is just unreal. You genuinely feel like that's a real piece of fabric. But you can see that in that crucifixion, it's very close to the Chicago crucifixion we've already showed you. You have a very brightly lit body of Christ. He feels very real. There's not, I think, if anything, it's maybe his mental suffering rather than kind of physical pain that we're looking at in that depiction of his body. 20 years later, we have the Christ on the cross with the Virgin Mary Magdalene and St. John the Evangelist from 1655, which is a very, very different picture. It's a picture that I find actually quite difficult to stand in front of. I think maybe that's because, for me, I know that by that point, Zurbarán's life has changed very, very dramatically. So in 1649, there's a plague that wipes out 50% of the population in Seville. The river that has been the gateway to the Americas is silting up. Crops have failed. There's been a famine. There's been flooding. I think it must, in some ways, have felt like living through the end of days. And where on the left we have the kind of that black, totally black, crisp black background. On the right, I find it almost more ominous that there's this sort of like memory of light at the bottom. There's this kind of lingering sky that sort of almost emphasizes the darkness more somehow. Zurbarán himself lost his son Juan, who you're going to meet in room 6 in the context of still life during that plague. He trained his son as a flower painter, and he was one of the 50% of the city who died. So they're just very, very different pictures, and the invitation from us to you is to spend some time with them and really appreciate how varied this artist can be and what a journey he himself goes on stylistically across his career. Thinking about journeys takes us into the 5th room of the exhibition, which we've titled Beyond Seville, because although Zurbarán spends the vast majority of his life and career in Seville, there are a couple of moments where he goes to work in Madrid at the royal court, and they're very important and very much worth pointing out. So in 1634, he is called to Madrid to paint in one of the most prestigious decorative programs of the period. He's asked to paint for King Philip IV of Spain. This is, it goes without saying, the highest honor that you get as an artist in this period. And he's specifically asked to come and paint for this room, which is called the Hall of Realms. And it's in the heart of Philip's new pleasure palace, the Palace of the Buen Retiro that he's building in Madrid. And this is the kind of ceremonial center of that palace. It's a room dedicated to the might of the Spanish monarchy, and it's a room to which Zurbarán is invited to contribute 12 paintings. So all the greatest living artists of the day are called to the court. They're all invited to paint. Only Velázquez paints more pictures for this space than Zurbarán. So it's just to give you a sense of how highly esteemed he was in this period. We are thrilled to have borrowed 2 paintings from the Prado from that Hall of Realms series. So one of the things he's asked to paint there is a series of 10 pictures of the labors of Hercules. Hercules was mythically the founder of the Spanish monarchy, so that's why the Spanish king would want to have a room filled with depictions of Hercules. You can see here that he takes some of what he already knows, you know, the dramatic poses, the strong lighting, the bold compositions on these diagonals, but he's transposing it here to a mythological setting. It's really his only kind of sustained engagement with the male nude throughout his career. So they're a very important series of works, and we're delighted to have been able to borrow them. We have not borrowed, but I did want to just show you the defense of Cadiz against the English. So all around the walls of the Hall of Realms were paintings that celebrated recent naval and military victories of the Spanish forces. And this is the one that Zurbarán paints of the defense of Cadiz against the English. It's an absolute masterpiece. It never leaves the Prado. So this we do not have, but we have got the Hercules pictures, and we are thrilled to have those. We are also thrilled to have this, which is our kind of curiosity for you, and one in which, again, we're sort of asking for people's views. This is a painting, it's the only one in the show that's attributed to Zurbarán rather than absolutely securely 100% fully by him. It is a mystery. I don't know if you can read the size of the captions. It is a 2.5 meter tall face, very imaginatively called Colossal Head, which really does what it says on the tin. It is a painting that first appears in the Buen Retiro Palace. I say first appears, it is first documented in the Buen Retiro Palace in 1661. Visitors to the palace are going up a staircase and they see this enormous head of a giant staring down at them and remark on how completely bizarre that is. And indeed, it remains bizarre in the context of the rest of the history of art. Again, asking if anyone can think of anything, but we and our colleagues have yet to come up with any other painting of a face on this scale in the 17th century. It's just, it's bonkers. It's even more bonkers if I tell you that in X-rays we can see that he starts life looking much more like a Roman general. So those luscious black locks and the lovely tache are not there in the original. I mean, it's hard to talk about the original. The painting starts out with very closely cropped hair and clean shaven. In the painting process, a decision is made to add the incredible hair and the curly tache and the beard, which sort of almost makes it stranger, because in the X-rays he looks a bit like a Roman general. Here, to me, I always kind of get the sense that he's maybe a really angry shepherd, because if you look at the very bottom of his collar, that to me feels like fleece. But we don't know. The answer is we don't know. It's a picture that's been, as I said, in the Spanish Royal Collection since at least 1661. It's been in the Museo del Prado since the Spanish Royal Collection was turned into the public museum. For a long time, it was attributed to an Italian artist called Vincente Carduccio. I first saw this in 2017 in the conservation studios at the Prado, which was a surreal experience, because it is, you'll see when you go downstairs, it's just huge. And I think when they started cleaning it, it became quickly apparent to colleagues there that this was nothing to do with Carduccio. It stylistically has very little to do with him. But the name that everyone kept coming back to over and over again was, could this be Zurbarán? The problem, as our wonderful head of conservation, Larry Keith, said to me when I went up, very earnestly with the question, could this be by Zurbarán, Larry? He was like, Fran, no one looks like themselves when they're painting a 2.5 meter tall face, which is true. So it's the first time this has been included in an exhibition devoted to Zurbarán. Although it belongs in the Prado, as do the Hercules paintings, it's the first time they've been directly juxtaposed together. We are really sort of asking questions with this. We're asking, what do people think? What do the public think? What do scholars think? How do we think spending time with this? How do we think that attribution stands up? But also, My gut instinct is there has to be a very specific reason to paint this. You do not happen to paint a 2.5 meter high face for the King of Spain. There must be a document, a play, an explanation, a court masquerade. There's something that will completely untangle this for us. We just don't know what it is. So if anyone has been reading obscure diaries from 17th century Madrid and comes across something, we would absolutely love to know about it. And then I shall hand over now to Daniel, who's going to take you through the Americas and still life.
So in that room beyond Seville, we also wanted to address, in passing, Zurbarán's career-long commitment to painting for the viceroyalties in the Spanish Americas. It is a major export market, and he paints, along with his workshop, huge numbers of pictures that are sent overseas, often on spec, with the idea that eventually he'll be repaid after a galleon returns. And we know this because in several occasions he seems to have not been paid and so had to sue people to get payment out of them, and was middlingly successful, often the case in lawsuits. And with these pictures, though, we get a sense of what these series might have been like when they were at their very, very highest quality. These two pictures are really exceptional. They're part of a series of Jacob and his 12 sons, so a series of 12 pictures, that are held here in the United Kingdom, in County Durham, in Auckland Palace, in Bishop Auckland. It is exceptional because these arrived very, very early in this country. They're already here by the 1720s and are bought by the Archbishop of Durham, Richard Trevor, in the 1750s. He then hangs them all together in the long dining room at Auckland Palace, and they have hung there and still hang there to this day. So we're very, very pleased to be able to have two of them for this exhibition. In advance of the show, we performed a major conservation treatment. Jack Chauncey and Valeria Kravchenko, our conservation fellows, worked on these pictures for about 1.5 years, cleaning out old restorations, doing some retouching, and generally making them look as good as they can. And in these, I think you see that same characteristic attention to the fabrics, to the details, and especially in the really wonderful basket still life that Asher is holding. You see this again, commitment to the representation of everyday life with unstinting detail. These works allow us to think about these bigger series that Zurbarán would have sent to the Americas. We know from contracts that about 120 paintings at least of his are sent to the viceroyalties in the Americas. So something we wanted to try and address in the exhibition without including many of these works. Some of them, it must be said, are of sort of workshop quality, and so representing these at the highest level was very, very important to us. And if you ever get the chance to go up to the Spanish Gallery in Bishop Auckland and Auckland Palace, you can actually see all of these works arranged as more or less they were in the long dining room. They're now embarking on a major conservation program to clean all of the other pictures in the series, and so I think within 1 or 2 years you'll be able to see the entire series reunited and looking very, very good indeed. The next section of the exhibition deals with just that bit of still life painting we saw in the basket that Asher holds. But it begins really with one of the incredible masterpieces of Zurbarán's career. This is the still life with lemons, oranges, and a rose, signed and dated in 1633, an exceptional loan to us from the Norton Simon in Pasadena, California. This picture has never before been in a Zurbarán exhibition. It was lent to the Prado last year, but only to hang on its own. And so we are very, very privileged to have it here in the context of an exhibition, because it will allow us to look very, very closely at it in relation to Francisco's other still lifes. And I say Francisco advisedly, because in this room we'll also see works by his son, Juan, who is a still life specialist that Francisco trains. This work, when it first emerged in the 1920s, was immediately compared to the abstract canvases of Cézanne and of Picasso. And when you look at it closely, I think you can see why. It's an exquisite representation of some kind of sacred geometry, or perhaps secular. 3 elements arranged across a polished table surface, the attention lavished on the reflections off the glinting metal plates, or the way that the ceramic and the light interact in the cup of water and rose, I think, give you a sense of how meticulous Zurbarán was. He is not, though, a still life specialist. We only know about 10 still lifes by him, and this one is the only signed and dated one. You can just make it out there in the bottom right corner. And I think he signs and dates this one because it is as much a testament to his own painterly skill, his capacity to illusion reality, as it is a potentially sacred painting. This is one of the things that we've seen, how it is that Zurbarán represents the sacred with the real. And in this picture, the cup of water and the thornless rose, of course, signs of the Virgin Mary, have led it to be read sometimes in a sacred way. But I think that this is just as much about Zurbarán wanting to show us his ability to capture reality and to make it almost more than real. And if you know our collection well, and you're all members, so I assume you must, then you will recognize this little motif. This motif, of course, relates to our picture, the cup of water and a rose, and we're hanging them just sort of right beside each other, so you'll be able to compare and contrast. This work is maybe a fragment from a larger picture, or it may have been painted indeed as a study. And if you compare the two, and the scale here is a little off, they're very, very similar in scale in real life, you'll get a sense that Zurbarán was obviously someone who composed his still lifes in a certain way, perhaps making individual motif studies that were then used to be incorporated in larger and more complex still life compositions. And that, indeed, is an argument that we are hoping to be able to press in this exhibition, with the exhibition for the very first time in any public show, these two works by Francisco. They are works that emerged in a French private collection in 2023, and they had long been in a French family collection since the early 19th century. But our colleagues at the Louvre and in their technical department, when they emerged in this collection, were very interested and began to do all kinds of scientific analysis of them. And it emerged that, although visible to the naked eye, in the corner of each painting, there are the marks and numbers that signify that they were part of the Spanish royal collection in the 18th century. And they tracked them back through inventories to discover that indeed these were in the collection of the Palace of La Granja, so just outside Madrid, and then collected by Queen Isabel. At that time, though, in the 18th century, Zurbarán was not a very well-known name, even in Spain, and so they were attributed to Murillo. But I think you will agree that when you see them alongside this tremendous still life from Monastic in Barcelona, it couldn't be more apparent that they are very seemingly the things that Zurbarán used to compose this larger still life in the middle. And our colleagues at the Louvre were able to do sort of a digital overlay in which they could prove that the scale of the two individual motifs and the scale of the alcarazas included in the large picture in the middle is exactly the same. So it seems that Zurbarán worked in this way to compose different kinds of still lifes. And this is especially interesting because this picture in the middle from Barcelona, there is an exact replica or another version of it that's at the Prado. So you get a sense that Zurbarán was someone who repeated some of his compositions and had these smaller paintings to use as references. But we also want to treat of his son, Juan. And Juan is a very interesting painter. He is someone who Francisco obviously trains from a very early age in the art of still life. And we're very privileged to have in this exhibition the first known signed and dated work by Juan de Zurbarán, who was born in 1620 and dies at the age of only 29 in 1649. So this work, which is signed and dated just on the left, they're hard to make out in this reproduction, is painted on copper, painted when he's about 18 or 19 years old. And if you see grapes in a still life painting, and you are studying up on your classics, you'll know that when grapes are represented, it's usually a reference to the legend of Zeuxis, this painter who in ancient times painted something so realistic, painted grapes so realistic, that birds came down to peck at them, so the story goes. And so I think Juan, perhaps with the assistance of his father, is making some kind of reference to that. He is, though, someone who has a somewhat different sense in his still life paintings. We only know 20 works by him. It's attested that he painted a couple of religious compositions, but none have come down to us. We only know him as a still life specialist. In his early works, such as in this one, he has some of the attitude of his father. They are simple, crisp, austere, and quite sober. But then he begins to paint quite differently. And in his later works, from sort of the last 9 years or so of his life, he paints these overflowing, abundant baskets with sort of Baroque inflections, leaves, flowers, citrus, all these elements that give you a sense that he is a rather different character from his father. And we know a little bit about that because Juan de Zurbarán was at this time the son of a very relatively wealthy artist, Francisco. He marries very, very well indeed for the son of a painter, and then proceeds, based on the archival documents, to fritter away his dowry on various luxuries. He is also known to affect the aristocratic prefix Don, so he would go by Don Juan de Zurbarán. And he's known also to have composed some poetry and to have taken lessons in the art of courtly dance. So certainly a man about town. And I think you get a bit of a sense of that luxuriousness in these paintings, which are so different in tone than his father's. In the final room of the exhibition, we wanted to turn to a different element of Zurbarán's, the father's, painting, as well as looking at some of the works that he makes in the very last decade of his life. Throughout his career, he paints works that are not intended, it seems, for large-scale ecclesiastical commissions. They are often, perhaps, for private oratories, that is to say, sort of small domestic chapels, for the use of families or individuals to inspire and guide prayer. And this work from Cleveland, Christ and the Virgin in the House at Nazareth, is a wonderful example of that kind of picture. Rather than these sort of grand figures and sort of moving narrative, we have a scene that is much more intimate, much more tender, one that is, I think, eliciting devotion. So we have Christ who has pricked his finger on the crown of thorns, and if you look closely downstairs, you can see just a drop of blood emerging from the point of his finger. His mother looking on, and if you look closely, you'll see tears streaming down her face, or at least not quite streaming, but tears beginning to emerge to wet her cheeks. And she, I think, looking at the Son and having this premonition of what his end is going to be, this painting is innovative also, because it's usual to represent Christ with the crown of thorns, separate from sort of the doleful Virgin. Zurbarán puts them together in one canvas, I think, to make this even more intimate sacred narrative have a greater emotional impact. The idea of the mother who knows that her son is going to die. This same sort of interaction, these stories of the life of the young Virgin, are another element of his paintings for private devotion. And the eagle-eyed among you will have spotted on the left picture from the Abelló collection in Spain, the same motif, the cup of water and a rose, that repeats 3 times in the exhibition. And in these paintings of the young Virgin, which are a bit smaller, you get a sense again of how these would have functioned in a devotional setting. These were meant to inspire and to guide in prayer, and indeed the young Virgin in both of these is already sort of looking upward and has a prayerful attitude. One of the other subjects that Zurbarán paints that seems to be closely related both to private devotional paintings as well as to still life are the wonderful paintings of the bound lamb, or the Agnus Dei. We have the finest version, which is that in the Museo del Prado, and it is a work of extraordinary poetry. It, in this very simple composition, gives you, through intense attention to the way the fleece looks, so much so that you can almost sink your fingers into it. If you look closely, you can see the lamb's eyes are open, it is bound and ready for slaughter. Of course, this could be understood as the Lamb of God, a representation of Christ and his sacrifice, but equally, as is often the case in Zurbarán, this is also something that he may well have seen and known well in Andalusia, which of course was a center of wool production. And if we think back on the fabrics that he's painted, so many of them are made from the very wool that clothes this lamb. And so this interaction between the divine and the human, between the mundane and the heavenly, is something that I think is perfectly encapsulated in his work in this really, really tremendous picture. And these paintings, there are several versions known, were clearly made for private collectors. In the 18th century, a British traveler, Joseph Townsend, sees one in the collection of a literary gentleman in Seville who says that he values the painting of the lamb more than 100 living lambs. So I think you get a sense of how important these pictures were throughout their existence. In 1658, Zurbarán, whose commissions have begun to decline in Seville, which has been impacted hugely by the Great Plague of 1649 that carries away his son as well as several of his young children, and 50% of the city's population, moves to Madrid, where he lives out his final years. In this period, he begins to paint in quite a different way. His works are soft, intimate, and they seem to be a reflection of his time spent, perhaps in the Royal Collection, with his good friend, Diego Velázquez. And the reason that we know that he's there in 1658 is that in late that year, he testifies in favor of Velázquez's nobility. And this was a great sort of theme in Velázquez's career, is his aspiration to the aristocracy. And at the end of his life, as painter to the king, he is granted that opportunity. And so a number of people, painters, artisans, and others, have to come to Madrid to testify on his behalf. And Zurbarán in his testimony says, I have known Don Diego Velázquez for 40 years. And obviously they have been in touch throughout those times that Zurbarán has gone to Madrid in 1634, and Velázquez must have facilitated access to the Spanish royal collections, where he sees works that had been relatively recently acquired by the Spanish kings, such as this Raphael, which I think give you some sense of where this new and late style comes from. Also the case in this work from 1659, The Holy Family from Budapest, a work so sensible and so different in its sensibilities than his other works, which are, as we've seen, direct lighting, intense poses. In these late works, there's a softness, which indicates that they're perhaps made again for private collectors. And he also insists on signing his works much more in the final section of his career. That's an especially interesting gesture on this picture, which I think is one of the most beautiful in that final room. The Veil of Veronica. The story of the Veil of Veronica is that Christ, on the way to Calvary, was assisted by a woman who washed his face with a cloth, and the veil became known as the Vera Icon, the Veronica. And in this image, we see something quite different than how other painters of this period represent Veronica's veil. El Greco, for example, represents the face almost as a portrait, as a scene image of a real person. And Zurbarán, earlier in his career, does do that on occasion. But in the 1658 picture from Valladolid, he, I think, is taking this visual game even further, as he does in this other picture from Bilbao. By painting the sort of stain of the face, rather than representing it as a real thing, I think he's forcing us to look very, very closely at not only the thing being represented, but also how it's being represented. And the fact that it hangs from a place we can't really see, held up by a single slim pin in the center, draws attention to the artifice of the image. It is a trampantojos, so a trompe-l'oeil a lo divino. Just like we've seen these sanctified portraits, this in a way could be considered almost a sanctified still life. And Zurbarán makes clear that he is the author of this illusion, signing on this little cardellino, this little piece of paper, stuck down on a fictive bit of wax that curls up and is torn around the edges. It is, I think, the final stamp of his authorial ambition, and I think it gives you some idea of what his ambitions were as a painter. And so with that, to conclude, Francesca will speak about one of the last and most affecting works in the show.
I'll be very brief because you've been very nice listening to us for a very long time, but this is a painting that you can't miss when you go through the exhibition. For all that we've told you today, Zurbarán's actually quite an elusive figure. We don't know any portraits of him. We don't know what he looked like. He doesn't leave us a self-portrait. We've got lots and lots of documents about commissions. Very rarely do we actually hear his voice. And I think this picture is really a moment where we sort of meet him as an artist. There is no precedent for this composition in Western painting. There's no biblical reference that says a painter witnessed the crucifixion. But here you see a painter with his palette, with his brushes charged, looking up at the dead Christ, and this incredible gesture of the hand on the heart, the open mouth. Some people think this is a self-portrait. I think it could be a metaphorical self-portrait, but I think this is a painter who believes in the power of painting and the power of paintings to move people, which we very much hope the exhibition will when you get the chance to go and see it later. Thank you very, very much for listening. It's been a pleasure chatting to you this morning.